On the first day of Christmas, my DM gave to me a mimic chest that won't stop biting. Hi folks, welcome to Glitter Void Gamecraft. My name is Eric, and this week we're doing something a little special. A one-toothed baby mimic chest. So even though we've been unable to play together lately, my D&D group did a Secret Santa gift exchange, and with Tasha's coming out and the rules, or at least implications, that PCs can get a baby mimic as a pet, I knew as soon as I drew that name what I was going to make for this person. This video is coming out a little bit later because I want to make sure that the recipient receives the present before the channel spoils it for them. But whatever time you're watching this video, whatever traditions you follow, just remember the real reason for the season. He's getting eaten by a baby mimic. Let's get crafting. The outside casing of all this was a pre-built chest from the craft store. I wasn't sure how durable the clay bits were going to be, so I wanted at least the outside to be sturdy. The inside would be made of clay, and as I've never worked with any kind of clay before, I decided to use the cheap air-dry clay. I removed all the hardware from the chest, latch, shackle, and hinges. Since they were already a nice shiny metal, I didn't want to befoul them with grimy clay smudges and wood stain as I worked. I made sure to store these out of the way and somewhere safe. Nothing would be worse than to get to the end and be missing a screw. I'm not a Swedish furniture store after all. I couldn't find my sandpaper, so I took a pass over all the rough edges with an emery board. The pre-built chest was pretty rough, and while I hoped the gift would be a surprise, I didn't want the surprise to be splinters. I prepped my work surface by covering it with some parchment paper and dove in. I flattened some hunks of clay and pressed them into the sides to form the interior surface. The clay was pretty dry, maybe that's normal, but it seemed to compound with the smooth insides of the chest and make it not stick very well. I did my best to press it into the sides and corners and tried not to have a large amount of clay on or over the lip of the chest so it would still be able to close when I attached the top half. To blend the separated clay chunks together, I wetted my fingers with water and smoothed out all the seams. I made a substructure for the tongue using crumpled up aluminum foil. This prevented me from having a solid mass of clay for the tongue, which would shorten the drying time. I made sure the tongue curled in slightly rather than the classic mimic look of hanging out and all over the place, again to make sure that the chest would be able to actually close. Once I was happy with the placement, I mooshed out a thin layer of clay and laid it over the substructure, smoothing the seams as before. I needed gums to stick the teeth into, so I rolled out a long snake of clay and pressed it into the top of the inside to create a ridge, smoothing it into the top of the chest. Using clay sculpting tools, I created texture throughout the mouth. If you don't have these tools, you could use almost anything: disposable utensils, popsicle sticks, pencil. I made a ridge down the middle of the tongue and gave all the other surfaces general wavy textures. In a lot of mimic artwork, there seems to be the implication that there's some sort of distortion happening as the illusion is broken, and I tried to replicate that on the floor of the mouth, or whatever you call this part. I further textured the tongue by tapping with my finger to disrupt the surface, creating a taste bud look that will catch dry brushing later. I was worried that the teeth would be too heavy on their own, so I cut small lengths of wire to act as internal supports. Once I got the first one in and put a small ridge between it and the gums, I realized that too many of these would make this a worthless gift for actually holding anything. So necessity became the mother of invention, and this was where the idea of the mimic as a teething baby came from. The upper half was done in a similar way, though I had to make some last-minute changes to the interior ridge to accommodate the tongue. Pulling small amounts of clay out of the way gave space for the tongue to sit when the chest was closed. I took extra care to make sure there wasn't any clay covering up where the hinges would sit, and then created a wire armature for the creature's uvula, embedding it in the roof of the mouth and covering it with clay. Then it was time to let this dry. I'm jumping back in the middle of this video because there's some stuff that I didn't get on camera because I was under a little bit of a time constraint. In my rush to get this done, I didn't notice when I bought the clay that it says to allow 2 to 3 days for it to dry. I didn't have 2 to 3 days, so I looked online for if there were options for baking this to speed it up, and I found some that seemed to indicate it at least wasn't going to catch on fire if you tried to do that. I did maybe 3 rounds of, I put it in the oven, set it to 170, set the timer for 30 minutes. When the timer went off, I turned off the oven and let it completely cool. I didn't want to put the whole thing in a hot oven and risk the extreme changes in heat doing something weird to the moisture in the clay. Can you tell that I've never worked with this material before? All right, let's get back into it. The clay shrank a shocking amount. Or maybe this is a normal amount, I wouldn't know either way. The bottom section completely separated from the chest. I didn't mind this too much since that meant I could go back in and coat the entire inside with glue to make sure that this piece didn't budge. The top piece seemed to hold itself into the grooves of the lid, but I was nervous that it would pop out unexpectedly. I tried to pry it out, but since I did this part second, the clay was much thinner since I knew what I was doing, and it completely shattered. At this point, I was already going to have to repair some of it, so I just pulled the pieces out to squish glue inside of this as well. I imagine if you use nicer clay, or at least clay that doesn't shrink, you'd be able to do this part without all the glue. I wasn't sure what the best option for gluing clay to wood was, so I went with wood glue. I just glooped in a bunch on both surfaces and got to work bridging the gap. I wanted to make sure the gap wasn't just bridged at the top. I wanted to fill in the space to make sure that there was something for the surfaces to bind to. Popsicle sticks were an almost perfect thickness to bridge the gap. I cut a few lengths and with a liberal amount of glue, jammed them in ever so delicately into the space between. The top part was done mostly the same, though with the inside being curved, I put the popsicle stick gap fillers in the long way. Once the glue had dried, it was time to remove the excess stick with a handsaw. Just kidding, I spent the whole time either worried I was going to cut my hand or the poor monster's uvula. A few passes with the hobby knife and the excess snapped right off. To repair the cracks, I used milliput, specifically the superfine white variety. This is actually used in the restoration of porcelain and fine chinas. It's a 2-part epoxy putty. Now, I've watched lots of videos where I see people using this with their bare hands, but it technically has a warning label saying be careful because it might cause an allergic reaction with your skin, so I decided to be safe rather than sorry and use gloves while working with this. I cut off equal parts of the 2 compounds and mixed them together. Working with wet gloves keeps it from sticking during the mixing process. By the time my hands were aching, I figured that was mixed enough and got to work mushing it into all of the cracks. This stuff is very nice, and when it cures, it is rock hard and it doesn't shrink at all, but it is also pretty expensive, so it wouldn't be feasible to make the entire structure out of this. A behind-the-scenes note, I actually have a ton more footage of this part than I ever would possibly need, because once I got my hands covered in this stuff, I couldn't really touch the camera, so it just rolled. I used a segment of the crafting knife blade to cut away at any of the milliput that got on the meeting surfaces. I didn't want to risk gouging the wood by chipping away after the milliput had dried. I formed the base for the eyes with the remainder of the milliput. The eyeballs themselves were 2 wooden beads embedded into the base, with more milliput to cover and hold them into place. I used a wet brush to remove any that got on the exposed part of the eyeballs, since once that dried it would give it a texture. After the milliput dried, a final round of sanding with actual sandpaper. Yay, I found it! And it's time to stain the wood. I used the only wood stain that I had on hand, and it hadn't been opened in years and ended up being way stinkier than expected. Even with the respirator mask on, I had to move this outside to finish up. I didn't notice how many milliput fingerprints that I got all over this until after I had stained it, at which point it was a little late to do any sanding. I masked off the wood so I could use some spray primer on the insides. For the skin, I used classic Mimic colors. Purple craft paint darkened with a tiny bit of black for the base coat. This required a few coats to not look streaky, but by the third pass, you couldn't even see the black undercoat. The milliput fingerprints were the most obvious right around the top by the eyes, so while I was doing the primer for this, I expanded it out to cover up the worst of the spots. Besides hiding my mistakes, I thought this would make a more gradual transition between the wood and the skin of the eye segments. For highlights, I did several gradually lighter dry brushes with shades of purple, and then blended in some turquoise to continue with the classic color scheme. If this were a scary grown-up mimic, I would have spent a lot more time on the eyes, but since this was supposed to be a cute baby, I went with simple cartoon eyes with just a dot of white craft paint. After a final dry brush of pure turquoise, I used a simple dark tan base for the teeth, or tooth I suppose, and a light tan dry brush focused on the tip to create highlights. A quick coat of a matte varnish to seal all the paint in, and then it was time to really wet their whistle. I've seen other crafters use gloss Mod Podge for water effects, and I thought this would be a cheaper alternative to a brush-on gloss varnish. I glued this inside the mouth and then dabbed the brush over all the surfaces to avoid any obvious brush strokes when it dried. Before reassembling, I went back to all the screw holes with a pin vise drill to make sure no clay or milliput was blocking the holes. I reinstalled the hardware, and then I was off to deliver the present.
No, drop it. We have a whole party of adventurers coming by later for dinner, and I don't want you spoiling your appetite. I hope you all enjoyed that video. If you did, let me know in the comments below. I always appreciate that. And let me know any ideas that you have for using this clay, because I have pounds of it and no idea what to do next. If you found anything in here particularly useful, consider giving it a thumbs up or subscribing to the channel. That really helps me out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Smile, I want to get this one for the Christmas card. Happy holidays!